Thanks, Florian.
Hi all.
I'm Robin, also known as 0xRob on Twitter and GitHub and stuff. I'm a data specialist at Dune. Today I want to talk a bit about the abundance in Blockspace and what do we actually do with it. So when I talk about Blockspace, I basically mean the total capacity of one or more blockchains for transactions. Today, we will only look at Ethereum and the layer 2s. So I set a time frame 2020 till basically now, 2024 and ongoing. So what has happened? Well, in 2020, we only had Ethereum. Vitalik only recently posted its first blog post on what a roll-up-centric roadmap would look like for Ethereum. In 2021, we changed the fee market by introducing dynamic fees. In 2022, we had a merge and we went from proof of work to proof of stake. And now recently in 2024, we introduced blobs. Now, if you ask me what has changed and what does that really look like, all this, well, I would say it kind of looked something like this. An explosion. We only had Ethereum, and now we have an explosion, basically, of layer 2s in the Ethereum ecosystem. And the data also confirms this, demonstrated here by the number of EVM chains on Dune. So yeah, more chains, basically. If we look at the throughput, transactions per second through the air, we can also see, yeah, more transactions. And then if we look at block space, the same trend continues. And block space here I define as gas per second. This is also often used by the chains themselves. And basically every transaction needs to burn a certain amount of gas depending on its complexity. And so the amount of gas is not fluctuating. It's the gas fees that you pay. The gas price is fluctuating. But if you do the same transaction like 2 years ago or the same transaction today, it will be the same amount of gas. So that's why I think gas per second here is a metric that's best suited to show the change in block space over time, independent of any price and market fluctuations. So third trend, yeah, more block space. What was the goal? Was it really just more chains, more transactions, more block space? Well, I disagree. I think we should strive for more innovation, more composability, more interoperability. If all this new block space that we've got in the last years is just filled with simple transfers of meme coins, I don't think we're making much progress. I think with increasing the capacity, we should also increase the complexity. And by doing more complex stuff on chain, we can drive innovation, which is our main goal. Now from that follows my main question for today. Basically, has the explosion of layer 2s led to an actual increase in on-chain innovation? So I think for that, it's important that we look further than transactions per second and gas per second. As analysts, I think we should be a little bit more creative and not fall back to the same old metrics. So when I put up this question, I think, all right, how can we measure this? And there's basically 100 different data points that we could look at. Today, with you all, I'd like to explore 3 of them. Now, how do we find what to look at? Here are 2 basic Etherscan screenshots. You won't need to read it. I'll spare you the details. But I'll have one simple one and one complex one. The simple one is basically a transfer of 30,000 Pepe tokens from one address to another. Now, oh, sorry. The complex one, well, that's another beast. I mean, I even can't read it here properly, but basically it does it swaps some order tokens to wrapped ETH and then unwraps the ETH and it sends it to an aggregator and that aggregator deposits it to an optimism gateway which deposits it onto optimism to transfer to a layer 2. So now I look at these two examples, and my question becomes, all right, do we have more of the left, the simple transactions happening, or are we actually doing pretty complex and interesting stuff? So where do I see the difference when looking at these two screenshots? Well, the first thing I look at is actual gas limit and usage, especially the usage. So for the simple one, it's 60,000 gas units. And for the complex one, it's actually 400,000. Now, how can we compare this? Well, let's define two eras. 2021, where we basically only have Ethereum, and 2024, where we have Ethereum. And for this data analysis, I will only look at Optimism, Base, and Arbitrum, which are the three biggest layer 2s. And to compare, I'm going to look at the gas usage distribution. Basically try to answer how often do these simpler 20,000, 40,000 gas transactions happen, and how often do these more complex 500,000 transactions happen. Now, these graphs show the answer. And these are not that easy to look at, but if we start with the left, we see the distribution of gas. So on the bottom, you see from left, very low gas, to the right, higher gas, basically up to 1 million gas for one transaction. And we see that there's a peak on the left at around 20,000 gas for a transaction, which makes total sense because that's around the gas you pay for a simple ETH transfer. And then we can compare the two eras. We can compare 2021 and 2024. Now you can already see some difference at the left peak of 20,000 gas, where in 2021 this was almost 50% of the actions happening on chain. In 2024 this has dropped to 20%. So these are the simple ETH transfers. Now if you want to look at the rest of the distribution, this chart is harder to read. So the right chart is exactly the same data, only in a logarithmic scale. And there you can see, there is a big difference. There is a change in the gas usage distribution for these two eras. Now the question comes, well, this change, is this happening on Ethereum or layer 2s? Well, let's just split up the data and look at them. On the left, we see 2021 in the dark compared to 2024 Ethereum. It's roughly the same, still logarithmic based. And on the right, we see the same baseline, 2021 Ethereum, and 2024 in green, the three layer 2s that we're looking at. My conclusion here, the gas usage distribution has changed, and we see that more complex transactions are actually happening on layer 2s. Let's look at a second example. When I look at these screenshots, one thing I read and notice, there's a difference in the function that's called. The simple example just calls a transfer function with a recipient and an amount of tokens. The complex example, well, it's, and I have to read this, it's swap and start bridge tokens via Optimism bridge, which is a bunch of input data. We can't really examine these function calls and how difficult they're written on chain. That's senseless. What we can look at is how many different functions are being used on these chains. What's the diversity of these different functions that are being called on the contracts? And so then we can look at the daily active functions, which you can see on the left for all the combined Ethereum and layer 2s, which is basically you take 1 day of data and you just count how many different functions are being called on chain for that day. And we see that this is basically, up and to the right. Then again, the same question arises. Where does this increase come from? And you can already see on the right side, when we break this down, the blue is just Ethereum, and the green is all the layer 3s, all the layer 2s, the three layer 2s, Optimism, Base, and Arbitrum. And we can see that this diversity in function calls is mainly present in these layer 2s. We can also quickly compare these three amongst themselves and look at which of these layer 2s have the most diversity. And here it's interesting to see, well, it's Bayes and Arbitrum that are having this big diversity in functions, and for optimism, it's actually lower than on Ethereum. That brings us to our final and third example of data we can look at. And this is often more for the Etherscan experts among us, but I tend to look at the internal transactions and the logs a lot. So whenever you have a transaction, if there's complex stuff happening and it calls other transactions to read stuff or do stuff, you'll see that show up in Etherscan in the traces or internal transactions. And whenever events are emitted, that will also show up. So here, the difference is very stark. For the simple transaction, there's just one log, a basic transfer event. For the complex transaction, well, there's 33 internal traces that we can examine and 14 logs that have been emitted. Now, I don't think it's very interesting to just count these. I think we should look at the actual data that is happening within these calls and that is being exposed by the events. So here, I suggest we combine the data volume, just counting the actual bytes in these internal calls and events, and we just combine them for traces and logs. For now, for simplicity. Of course, you can split them up and dive into them deeper. What does that look like? Well, it paints a similar picture. We see that there definitely has been an increase in internal data traffic. On the left, you see the combined internal data traffic per day for Ethereum and Layer 2s, which is above 30 gigabytes a day. If we split this again for Ethereum only and the 3 Layer 2s combined, we can see that, well, this growth has mainly been with the explosion of Layer 2s. It has risen on Ethereum, but not as drastically. So we can see here that, indeed, L2s are driving more growth in internal data traffic. Now let's split them up again and see what's the difference. Let's start on the left. Here, this is the same data, so internal data traffic per day. And here we see, well, a very distinct picture. It's Bayes that has literally gone to the moon in terms of internal data traffic, rising above 20 gigabytes per day, and then followed by Arbitrum, Optimism, and Ethereum. Now, when I saw this graph, it rang the bell. It looked very similar to just the amount of transactions per day happening, which makes total sense. Bayes has exploded with transactions, and with more transactions a day should only come more internal data traffic a day. So then here, I think it's important to also normalize this data. So if we account for the amount of transactions a day that has been happening, then we basically get the right chart, which shows the average internal data traffic per transaction for each chains. Here we see a different picture. We still see clearly that Ethereum has the lowest value here, then followed by Arbitrum and Bayes, and it's actually Optimism where the internal data traffic per transaction is the highest. Now, we've had these 3 data points, and I think these have shown to me, these aren't like the holy grail of data points. There are 97 others out there we should explore. But if we explore these 3, we can see that more complexity was shown by the difference in gas usage on Layer 2s. We can also see that there was more diversity shown by a higher daily active function set. And we can see that there was more internal data being processed by counting the data in the traces and logs. And so therefore, my conclusion for this is that indeed, we are doing well, we are doing good. L2s are at the frontier of the current innovation. Thank you all. Take some questions from the audience, if there are any.
you looked at labeling the Blockspace demand at all? I think Row the Pie is doing great work with
Yeah,
this.
I think they are, and I tried not to compete with that. I think it would have been a lot more effort to actually gone through that. But yeah, it would be really interesting to split this up and see, all right, what are the complex transactions? What are those? Are they actually really useful new applications, or are they mainly like complex trading bots, complex MEV bots? This would be an interesting follow-up question and topic.
No one else with any questions?
Alan has a question.
This is in the similar, but on a lot of the graphs there was like a spike at the end.
Oh yeah.
What did you have a chance to look at those? Like what type of transactions those are?
If you mean a spike at the gas usage distribution,
yeah.
So these are basically, yeah, I can pull back. Yeah, good call. These are all the transactions. This is basically representing the long tail. So all, yeah, here it is and here as well. So all the transactions above 1 million gas are grouped there together. Just to be consistent and that all the percentages here actually add up to 100. So yeah, this is, you can imagine like the chart goes like way far ahead and it's a really long tail. Yeah.
All right, if there's no one else, thank you for this presentation, Rob.
Final?
Oh.
Okay, one serious question here.
Yeah.
How many spells did you have to write to get those socks?
Ah, good question, good question. Well, none for the moment, but there's some data in there that is coming from spells, especially like the gas distribution. We have a new gas fees spell that's really useful to look into like gas data on all the chains, basically. Yeah.
Is that one you're working on right now?
Yeah, it's out there already. So if you want to look into gas and especially fees data, go have a look and see what you can do with it.
Well, give it up for Rob one more time.
All right, thank you.